Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Clyde Park Church of the Nazarene YouTube channel. In this new series of videos, we will explore the Old Testament wisdom literature. This video will introduce that series and wisdom itself in the Hebrew Bible. The goal of this series is to help you gain an understanding of the Old Testament wisdom literature and a few subjects pertaining to it. In this video, I will introduce the subject at hand. So let's discuss questions like what is wisdom literature? What is wisdom? And what must you know about this kind of literature and more? So, what is wisdom literature? Well, Jewish wisdom literature is a set of texts where wisdom and folly are paramount themes. Certainly, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job are included in this collection. Other Christian traditions include other books such as Sirach or the Book of Wisdom. There is discussion about whether or not the Song of Solomon and some, if not all, of the Psalms should be a considered part of this literature as well. For the purposes of this video series, I will include both those books as part of this literature. So Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Song, and Proverbs will all be included. The designation wisdom literature dates back to at least the time of Augustine, a 4th century Christian bishop and theologian, according to Baden and Collins. I will note that all of the resources that I use for this video will be down in the description, so if you want to fact check me or do your own research, I would highly encourage you to do so. There is a debate over whether or not this body of text should be conceived as a tradition rather than a wisdom genre. Uh, to simplify, however, I will use the term wisdom literature throughout this series. Importantly, wisdom literature, unlike other kinds of literature in the Bible, has man speaking to God rather than God speaking to man. The literature gives us examples and language for talking about God. Related to this is that the literature meets the reader where they are in their spiritual journey, and there is a posture of challenge and skepticism when seeking after God. Many of the Psalms and Job are good examples of this. So now that we have a little bit of a handle on what the Jewish wisdom literature is, we now have to ask, what is wisdom? It's hard to give a concise definition of wisdom because of how the Hebrew term for wisdom and its synonyms are used. Therefore, it is useful to talk about several aspects of wisdom. Biblical wisdom is a way of life or path that's in harmony with God's creation and his redemptive work. Belcher notes that wisdom generally refers to a gift that is given by God and a skill that is learned or developed. Bartholomew concludes wisdom refers to a very wide range of desires, behaviors, skills, and beliefs, all of which find their hub in the order God has created into our world. Furthermore, Firth states the following. In brief, Old Testament wisdom deals with how to navigate life successfully. It appears that it is better to think about biblical wisdom as having several aspects. Therefore, let's explore several key aspects of the concept of wisdom in the Hebrew Bible. There are theological components to wisdom. For example, God is said to have wisdom in Proverbs 8 and Job 12:13, and created everything by wisdom according to Proverbs 3:19 through 20. Furthermore, it is written, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in Proverbs 1:7. Much can be said about this idea of fearing God. However, for this section, it is sufficient to note that Dr. Longman states, the one who fears God will follow the advice that God imparts through the sages. This verse and others like it, Ecclesiastes 12:13 and Job 20:28, ground wisdom in the theological. God has imparted wisdom through these books, much of which is still relevant today. Another aspect of the theology of wisdom is creation. The idea of creation plays a pivotal role. For example, Psalm 104, verse 24 says, O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. God's creation exists and consists due to Lady Wisdom. Wisdom's association with the material plane also occurs in the character of Solomon. Solomon is the famous king of Israel whose wisdom is said to be, quote, as vast as the sand on the seashore, according to 1 Kings 4:29. Solomon prayed for wisdom to help govern the people in 1 Kings 3. The wisdom he received was helpful to that end, but God gave him more. And in 1 Kings 4:33 it is written, he would speak of trees, he would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. Wisdom then is not just about the knowledge given by or about God, but also the knowledge and study of the material world. Kidner makes the following observation. This is the faith in which the natural world can be confidently studied, whether by a simple observation of its patterns and its everyday sequences, such as are noted in Proverbs, or by the more rigorous techniques of modern science, both of which assume that reason can be fruitfully applied to the phenomena before us. There is a real social aspect to the wisdom of the Hebrew Bible that must be remembered. To quote Mark Sneed at length, wisdom literature throughout ancient Israel was used in the training of young scribes. The guild's forte was cultural, and its perspective was also heavily androcentric. The biblical wisdom literature reveals both its composers and audience's retainer class status, as well as their search for high prestige, which reflects the concern for honor and shame that was part of Israelite society as a whole. The wisdom literature reflects attitudes regarding slavery. The wife needs to be good to bring honor to the family rather than shame. So here's an important question. If the wisdom literature uses honor and shame culture rhetoric or finds no fault in the institution of slavery, then shouldn't the church today do the same? This question is why the church must use good interpretive methods and remember the social context from which the culturally situated wisdom arises. And I will give a case study here. Proverbs 23:13 says, do not withhold discipline from your child. If you beat them with a rod, they will not die. If you beat them with a rod, you will save their lives from Sheol. The rod here is not a metaphor. The same word appears when discussing the beating of slaves in Exodus 21:20. It is a weapon of war in Isaiah 30:31 and Jeremiah 51:19 through 20. It can also refer to a shepherd's staff, see Micah 7:14. Giving the phrases of this and related verses, the text suggests that beating your child with a physical object will truly help your child. This is also how later Jewish sources understood Proverbs. For example, in the extra biblical wisdom book Sirach, it states, a father who loves his son will whip him often so that he can be proud of him later. So we understand the culturally situated wisdom of ancient Israel. But the question is this supposed to apply to the present day New Covenant believer? What is the Christian parent and particularly father is given the ancient context supposed to do? So Daniel Garland notes that Roman law allowed fathers specifically to abuse their children, even chain them up. It is in this Roman and Jewish context that Paul writes, fathers, do not provoke your children or they may lose heart. In another place, Paul says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Garland argues that St. Paul is telling fathers not to abuse their children because they will drive them away from the faith. The children will become angry, rightly so, and abandon the faith. The Apostle Paul, by setting forth new and different standards for how to treat children, is initiating a progressive change. Bible scholar William Webb has developed something called the redemptive hermeneutic to explain these kinds of ethical shifts. Webb argues that ethics surrounding several topics, such as women and slaves, uh, and as I've argued, children, progressively improve as you move from covenant to covenant. From the present analysis, the conclusions can be thus. Hebrew Bible wisdom is situated in the culture and covenant of Israel. Due to this, one must take note of that context to properly understand the wisdom. To apply the wisdom, We must look at the Bible and context as a whole to determine how the wisdom should be engaged by the church today. Fourth, application of the redemptive hermeneutic and progressive revelation can help us understand the Bible as a whole. And five, we do not need to be okay with slavery or have an honor and shame community today. Now, related to culture is the tradition. Tradition plays a huge factor in this. In ancient society, wisdom was to be found in the tradition of the fathers. And so these teachings get passed down from generation to generation and sort of show themselves to be true in light of the society by being so passed down. There's also moral dimensions to wisdom, and this is seen in the fear of the Lord. The wise person is supposed to be a good or virtuous person. Longman points to Abraham as a climactic example of the proverb, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. After Abraham is stopped from doing the human sacrifice, it is written, "Now that I know you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Genesis 22:12. Obeying the command of the Lord shows that you fear God. Ecclesiastes 12:13. It is written in Job, God said to us humans, to be wise, you must have reverence for the Lord. To understand, you must turn from evil. Job 28:28. This kind of moral skill starts with a relationship with the Lord. That does beg the question, can the non believer demonstrate moral wisdom? I would argue yes, based on Genesis 20. King Abimelech had gained Sarah, Abraham's wife, as his wife. Abraham told him that Sarah was his sister, which Abraham had done once before in Genesis 12 with the king of Egypt. God appears to the king in a dream and converses with the king about taking Sarah. Then it is written, now then, return the man's wife. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all that is yours. Genesis 27. The rest of the story shows that Abimelech obeyed the command of God. Given that the king was in the land of Canaan, Genesis 21 through 2, we can assume that he was a non believer. Thus, we have historical precedent for the non believer obeying God, and thus, even if a little, demonstrating moral wisdom. The Apostle Paul also talks about the consciousness of the Gentiles and how the Gentiles can do things that are in the law and good things that are in the law. And Jesus can talk about how a non believer can be a good father and so on. So while the non believer can demonstrate moral wisdom, I would say that there is still something lacking, and that is the fear of the Lord. We have no reason to think that this king converted to the faith, and he seems to have obeyed God, for example, much out of fear, like fear. And the king seems to have obeyed God, yes, but out of concern for the consequences of not doing so, rather than out of faith, out of love for God, and these sorts of things. So, morally speaking, the non believer is lacking something by not fearing the Lord. And finally, wisdom is extremely practical. For example, Proverbs 19:20 says, "Listen to advice and accept instruction that you may gain wisdom for the future." I mean, that's a very practical verse. It's on the ground wisdom, and it's the kind of thing that believers and non believers can demonstrate. Uh, Simply, we must learn from others and accept corrections from others if we are to navigate the future. Furthermore, we also see the idea of wisdom more broadly understood as skill. For example, the Bible Project notes that artists and craftsmen in Israel was said to have chokmah, that is skill, and this is the word that is translated as wisdom. The New English translation also talks about wisdom being skill, and in the case of Proverbs chapter 1, moral skill in their translation. So, as we have seen from the study, wisdom has many different aspects to it in the Hebrew Bible. While more can always be discussed, I'm hoping this will whet your appetite for this kind of literature. Now, we've looked at the Old Testament, we've looked at the Old Covenant, but now we have to ask ourselves as Christians, as the church, as the people of God, how does the New Testament literature embrace wisdom? What does the New Testament literature think about wisdom, the Old Testament wisdom literature, and so on? And that will be the discourse of our next video. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. If you enjoyed, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the Clyde Park Church and Nazarene YouTube channel for more Bible content. If you're interested in more content, then you can check out the shorts that we upload weekly, as well as our weekly live streams of our Sunday morning services. Thank you so much again, and God bless.